Okay, so now we are on Prisoners of Freedom, chapters 3 and 4 by Harry Englund. We start with chapter 3, The Hidden Lessons of Civic Education, Training the Torchbearers. So here, Englund is not focusing simply on how people receive a topic like human rights, but how the instructors are instructed in teaching about human rights. So he has begun by pointing out that translating human rights from, say, the Declaration of Human Rights or the conventions that have been signed by different parties in the UN are not really enough when illiteracy is widespread. So here, he turns his attention to the civic education initiatives that are sort of the source of instruction in human rights for Malawians, human rights and democracy. He finds, though, that this particular educational venture, rather than undermining systems of privilege, advantage, and disadvantage, in fact wind up reinforcing privilege and status between instructors and the grassroots, those who the instructors aim to teach. The educational model is essentially similar to that of charity, which is to say there are those who provide charity or help and those who are in need of charity. Those who possess something that others lack, again like charity, giving that thing, however, does not produce structural change. So that if we think of the way that charity is meant to ameliorate disagreeable situation, disadvantage, but not change the overall structure of a society, an economy, a political model, then we can see how charity is the model that we find here. England notes that the civic education project where he did field work, that is with NICE, in fact reproduced status hierarchies, not just between educators and grassroots recipients of that education, but also within the organization between salaried education officers and what he calls parasivic educators or volunteers, who were drawn to the status that volunteering as an educator could provide. So that even though they weren't getting remuneration, a wage, they were gaining status by being involved in this kind of project. Now, Englund notes that the Civic Education Initiative grew out of voters' education campaigns. So they are an inheritor of the shift from like a one-party state to a multi-party democracy. And yet it maintains the condescension towards the poor masses of Malawians that characterized that earlier campaign, who they opined lacked, quote, the necessary intellectual competence and capacity needed to articulate such a subject as human rights. Education and civic rights, therefore, was carefully crafted to assert human rights activists' special status by emphasizing their credentials, their use of titles, and their preference for English. Much of the actual work involved signposting, which is to say that educators, say, faced with questions from villagers, rather than finding a way to resolve those questions and those problems, would refer villagers on to other organizations and other authorities who may or may not be able to respond to the issues that the villagers raised. The most important civic education intervention began in anticipation of the 1999 elections, when the EU funded a voter education project, the National Initiative for Civic Education, NICE. Englund characterizes NICE as a project with as much or even greater reach than the state. So, for example, it had an office in every district in the state, and also it had significant funding. The question of funding will become a thorny one, as we'll see in a moment. The point here, though, is that as an organization on that scale, it actually winds up having a kind of governing function within Malawi, which is not to say governing in the sense that it is part of the government, but in the sense that it is able to exercise a certain kind of governing force over the populace. Englund writes, crucial to the work of governance that NICE performed were the many subtle ways in which its officers and volunteers created a sense of belonging to an exclusive community of human rights experts. The sense of exclusiveness, right, because any kind of sense of inclusion necessarily has a border around it that excludes those who are not included. So the sense of exclusiveness arose at the recruitment stage, where applicants seeking positions with NICE far outnumbered the positions available, and in promotion, which they garnered through competition within NICE. Right? So that if you wanted to rise through the ranks of NICE, there was a competitive field to do that. Workshops and seminars further reinforced officers and volunteers' sense of belonging to NICE. And this is important, right? The sense that they belong to NICE is not the same thing as saying that they belong with the Malawians who they are instructing. That in fact you wind up having a greater sense of inclusion within NICE and a sense of kind of differentiation from the villagers and communities who they were to educate about democracy and human rights. The way that human rights take on a cultural dimension is not restricted to the fostering and formation of feelings of belonging within NGO recruitment and advancement, but also in the way that officers partake of, for example, goat culture. So one of the things that we are becoming attuned to here through Englund's work is the idea that you can talk about human rights in the abstract, and he suggests that this is a lot of what members of NICE do, but that they, in fact, enter practice within specifiable cultural realms. And so those realms or those settings are deeply significant for the way that people will then practice human rights, for good or for ill. One of the ways that this appears in Malawi is this idea of goat culture. The idea is that when NICE officials and volunteers went to a village, the villagers should prepare a meal for them. They should host them. It would, a NICE official reasoned, give villagers a sense of ownership, so that you have, in this way, either salaried staff or salaried staff and volunteers arriving in a village to engage in education about human rights and democracy. And the expectation was that although they're the ones earning the salary, the poor villagers have a kind of a cultural obligation to play the part of host and to prepare a spread for the officials. The justification for this, because it looks an awful lot like resource extraction from the poor to the officials in NICE. So then the reasoning behind this is that by engaging in this cultural tradition or this cultural convention of playing host to outsiders, the villagers get a sense of ownership over the educational process. The implication then was that NICE was there to help communities solve their problems, and that the communities should reciprocate by feeding people from NICE. Englund writes, under such circumstances, goat culture represented little else than an attempt by the well-off to manipulate local moral codes for their own benefit. NICE was especially attractive for young men who would volunteer, often young men from the very settings in which the education would later occur, because with the advent of multi-party democracy, it offered a source of identity at a moment when the divide between aspirations and opportunities was especially vexing. So that you would have these young men, some of whom may have had to abandon their school studies. It would give them then a sense of being able to do something that gave them status at a moment when their aspirations for status, for employment opportunities, and so forth were greater than the opportunities that were actually available to them. NICE, by offering symbolic and material trappings that could enhance their status and self-esteem, contributed to the pacification of young men who, in an earlier moment, might have been drawn into political violence instead. That is to say, at an earlier political moment, the sort of the mass of young men looking for something to do, looking for a place to establish an identity, could be used as a resource for political figures who wanted to apply force against their opponents or would-be opponents, but did not want to do that themselves. And so they would be able to draw on these groups of men, young men, who were otherwise unoccupied, and use them to exercise violence. Okay. Self-regulation of NICE members was a major preoccupation of the organization. Why? Because the organization was officially politically neutral and had to maintain that neutrality publicly. So while voicing sharp critiques of the government in private, their public roles required them to stifle that same criticism, instead placing the fortunes of democratization on the ability of the grassroots to understand and adopt values and attitudes NICE sought to cultivate in them. The idea here being then that although NICE members might have quite stern, sharp criticisms of the government, in their working lives, the message that they would give is that it was up to the grassroots to make democracy work, and if it didn't, if democracy failed, that was because the grassroots failed to adopt the right values and attitudes. He says, Englund does, fluent critics of the government in private, they would in public place the onus of democratic change on the grassroots. Officers in particular undertook to suppress volunteers' challenges to the status quo. Because again, you would have perhaps young men who had strong political opinions, and so the officers would need to get those volunteers to, at least publicly, keep their opinions to themselves, because that could imperil NICE otherwise, if those opinions were expressed as at least appearing to be under the purview of NICE. The contradictions do not end there, though. Englund describes how even in workshops on civic education, where democracy and transparency were the explicitly declared organizing principles, that is, of the organization and of the way that lessons would be conducted, Proceedings took an hierarchical form. Status was an ever-present concern and subtly on display. For example, in seating arrangements, where the most prominent figures in a community would be the ones who with whom nice officials sat, where nice officials would be located during a lesson, say at the front of a room with everybody else arranged around them. Or that there would be particular rules about decorum, say that you had to turn off your cell phones during the lessons, but there would be exceptions made, of course, for the officials who laid out these rules, and they could take calls and engage in things that they explicitly prohibited others from doing. So that there was, in brief, a hierarchy of statuses here. Nice implicitly constructed the grassroots as their object of civic education. Alongside this is another construction making volunteers appear to be those who could help the grassroots. In itself, this provides volunteers with a status distinct from the grassroots. And again, it doesn't matter if the volunteers came from the same villages or the same sorts of villages in which this instruction occurred. The point was that membership with NICE allowed them to take a kind of distance from the grassroots. At the same time, though, their familiarity with the grassroots, for example, with things like goat culture, could become recast as skills that they could use as civic educators. So they could deploy this familiarity with the communities in which they were disseminating these lessons about human rights and democracy, and they could deploy them as skills of a particular kind. Volunteers training endowed them then not just with the skills they would need for their work, but also with self-esteem as NICE representatives, hence as the type of clean, presentable Malawian who defines what progress and development are, right? That they could present themselves as the kind of professional having a kind of expertise that they could use to present themselves with a certain kind of status that would allow them to exercise some authority within the teaching environment, within the educational environment. The use of English establishes status in a couple of ways. First, it distinguishes languages, right? So Chichewa, as explicitly lacking a vocabulary and therefore as lacking the concepts that are relevant to civic education. And English, by contrast, as providing that vocabulary and those concepts. The implication then also is that those who only speak Chichewa and not English themselves must lack those concepts and stand in need of education from those who are in possession of English and therefore are in possession of the concepts. Second, though, it distinguishes people, those with the training to perform the technical procedure in question, conflict resolution, civic education, what have you, and those lacking this training and therefore lacking the English terms. To a large extent, this fascination with English, a colonial residue persisting in the post-colonial era, traces back to Banda's regard, entrenched through his 30 years of rule, for England and English as the master symbols of progress. So that you get this kind of inheritance from the colonial era through Banda's rule to the post-colonial era with multi-party governance. NICE members faced a particular challenge. Their training was to distinguish them from the grassroots, give them expertise villagers lacked, But this put them in competition with elders, elders being conventionally held as the embodiment of wisdom and authority. So this is a problem, right? There's a kind of competition for authority brewing here. Nice members often thought that elders' knowledge was deficient, though. For example, they would say that elders attribute aids to witchcraft, and how can we work with that, right? So that they would feel themselves to be at loggerheads with elders. In several ways, then, the training youth volunteers received encouraged them to identify with nice and experienced a boost in their self-esteem by becoming able to define themselves as intrinsically different from the impoverished multitudes. Now, one of the things that they could do with this is, in a context in which they were having to exert authority in the presence of elders, is they could solicit opinions from a wide range of villagers who were there and wait sort of until they heard an opinion that aligned with the answer that they wanted for the questions that they were posing about democracy or about human rights. At that point, they could repeat and reinforce that particular answer, the right answer. And so by doing that, they could kind of signal that if elders wanted to save face, they would have to also endorse this idea. And so then elders would endorse that idea because they want to maintain their authority within the community. And it would then therefore get the stamp not just of the experts, nice, but also of the elders within the community, so that here you go, you have this kind of doubly reinforced message. But that requires a certain kind of maneuvering around the authority of elders to subtly undermine it and then restore it only once the elders are able and willing to sign on to the ideas, the concepts, the language that nice members require. But in doing this, again, the point is that the volunteers as well as the officers wind up forging an identity with nice that distinguishes them from the villagers and the communities. So he says, officers warned against embarrassing elders in public. A better strategy was to solicit several viewpoints on the same issue, and when the right answer appeared, the civic educator would start repeating it in different forms. The intent would be to make the crowd accept the message without appearing to impose it on them. Elders, in turn, would seek to avoid embarrassment by aligning themselves with the emerging dominant view. Civic educators took their teaching on democracy and human rights as having this kind of revelatory potential. Englund explains, the paramount task of organizations providing civic education was to carve out a space where the substance and implications of human rights could be debated. Through their training, he explained, youths sincerely concerned with Malawi's democracy come to identify more with their quasi-professional status at NICE than with the targets of civic education. He has, however, raised doubts in this chapter about the success of civic education, specifically in its relation to taken for granted hierarchies in society. It seems, in short, to do nothing to undermine those hierarchies, but rather to deploy them in the service of its work. The sustained emphasis on values, attitudes, and behaviors at the grassroots. Remember, those are the things that the grassroots has to change in order to secure the future of democracy, contributed most directly to civic education's propensity to maintain long-standing hierarchies. This placed the burden of democratization and incorporation of human rights into Malawian society on the disadvantaged, rather than giving them tools to confront the power relations that underlay human rights violations. Again, we'll come back to this as we go through the chapter, that the insistence on abstract ideas of human rights and democracy, rather than focusing on the specific challenges, let's say, that villagers faced, would be a way of systematically avoiding discussing the things that actually led to the kinds of deprivations that villagers in Malawi faced. The outcome of this sort of education, then, is to contribute to undemocratic governance rather than to cultivate and sustain democratic governance. Now, in this chapter, Englund explores how NICE, by making communities responsible for their own development, pull yourselves up by your own bootstraps kind of scenario, presented political problems as reducible to communities, which in effect makes communities the problem, rather than the economic and political circumstances within which communities find themselves positioned. As high-ranking NICE officers explained, communities must realize or be brought to recognize that they had problems, and NICE could help resolve them. Now we'll see that the problems that NICE expects communities to have, and therefore to try and resolve, don't really align with the problems that members of the community themselves say that they have. And so the immediacy of the problems that they face kind of get pushed to the side and remain unresolved. Why? Because NICE has a specific idea of what sorts of problems beset communities, and that's what they want to get communities to recognize and therefore to try and work on and resolve. Positioning the community as the problem and civic education as the solution also allowed NICE to avoid raising questions of power and injustice. It allows those questions to remain off to the side. Why? Because they might appear to politicize the work that NICE is doing, and that would have dire consequences for NICE. Ideas like participatory development and community empowerment. So these were ideas that became prevalent, widespread, and kind of doctrine within the development community around the world in the late 70s through the 90s, I would say. And the whole thrust behind them was to give communities who were the recipients of development a voice and a role in determining what that development looked like and how it would be undertaken, right? So they're supposed to be kind of emancipatory concepts. So, okay, ideas like participatory development and community empowerment, in which the grassroots had a role in determining the development projects that would affect them. These ideas foundered on the tendency in Malawi for paternalism and top-down planning that cast the community itself as the problem that development planning must solve. So that in that way, the way that community development would look would be that it would be delivered from the outside to solve problems that were pervasive inside the community, that the community itself both perpetuated and could not fix itself. The prioritization of the community held the promise that ordinary people's viewpoints would also be the priorities of civic educators. The idea of community, though, was abstract, not specific, so that, paradoxically, differences in particular communities' real lives were not discernible. They kind of got erased under this generic sense of community. And the message of civic educators was therefore standardized and generic, tailored to nowhere in particular. This lack of attention to particular places, and therefore the specific struggles of those people in those places at that time, was also reflected in the tendency of officers to spend just the minimum amount of time necessary in any given locale, and therefore not learning anything about that specific locale and the people who lived in it, to deliver the nice lesson, and as I say, without learning the struggles that are specific to that place and to those people. And so you can imagine the solutions that they derive are, they're not, as I say, tailored to fit the problems that those people in that place actually face. Englund writes, when the officers stayed long enough to eat, according to goat culture, their hosts were local dignitaries, so not the mass of people who lived in a location. Civic educators did not, in other words, challenge existing hierarchies, but became firmly placed within them. One way that inattention to particular needs, challenges, and aspirations of specific communities arose was in the way that NICE conducted its education on democracy and human rights. It would solicit responses in small group discussions on the definition of democracy, but would studiously ignore those answers before explaining what the one correct answer was. Now, we've already seen this in the previous chapter around the question of how to deal with elders, right? It's the same kind of strategy. Officers would return to groups' definitions only in later sessions on misunderstanding democracy. So, so then the villagers' responses become examples of misunderstanding rather than their views of human rights. Englund goes on to explain. Crucial to understand here is that officers' preoccupation with right answers gave them little chance to actually listen to what transpired during the small group discussions. So in a sense then, their attention is in the wrong place if they want to understand what villagers actually confront in their lives. As scrupulously politically neutral, organizations like NICE are an important source of unbiased information for voters. And you can see that, right? That if media like newspapers or the radio are largely organized around the interest of political parties, then the information that they deliver will also be biased in favor of those parties. An organization like NICE then, because it has to remain politically neutral, can be an unbiased source of information. And yet, much of the information they offer is too abstract to resonate with the grassroots and may serve to obscure the politics of patronage in Malawi. As an example, civic educators asked their audience to believe that it was ordinary villagers who were responsible for running the country, a claim, not surprisingly, that struck villagers as kind of absurd when they would see how little responsiveness politicians would actually show to the villagers themselves, to their constituents. This connected, in turn, to the assertion that villagers, through volunteered labor in the name of participation, right? So the idea of community participation here becomes not that you are included in the process of working out what development, what democracy will look like, but rather volunteer labor, that they should be the agents of their own development. When this suggestion met with resistance, civic educators chided villagers. He says, investigations into actual experiences and aspirations never replaced the urge to teach abstract principles to an abstract community with condescending assumptions about the villagers' ignorance and laziness never far below the surface. Englund opens this section describing a session dedicated to problems that arise from people's misunderstanding of democracy. Again, we can recall the examples that they will use will be the examples taken from the small group sessions in which villagers are invited to give their answers about what democracy is. And so villagers would include things like inflation or lack of access to credit, rudeness, disobedient children, that these are the things that are a problem for democracy. Lessons about democracy in the abstract, devoid of any actual problems, silenced the problems faced in fact. And it didn't allow people to explain what democracy meant to them. So Englund says, if authorities do hear the complaints of their people, had they not also if authorities do not hear the complaints of their people, had they also misunderstood democracy? So the sense here is that if authorities are deaf to the complaints of their people, in what sense are they democratically responsive to their constituents? Englund suggests that maybe they're not. So maybe they're the ones who are misunderstanding democracy. At educational sessions on human rights, disconnections could open between the educators and villagers, as, for example, when an officer would solicit villagers' views of human rights, and among responses like speaking without fear or free schools, would also get impatient laments about poverty and the lack of credit. So answers that did not line up with the abstract principles of human rights that the educators sought. The officers would typically not see how the lesson on abstract notions of freedom could connect with the reality of poverty. And so they would pivot away from villagers' concrete concerns and back toward the abstract ideas. While officers might try to bring the lessons back on topic, that is, onto the topics that they wanted to talk about rather than the villagers, villagers would often insist on keeping their topics, poverty, credit, lending organizations' fees, in the discussion. And by doing that, would subtly decline to be merely recipients of knowledge, but also sources of knowledge, if only the educators would listen. Englund summarizes the chapter so far like this. He says, civic education officers' encounters with the grassroots show how they pursued an apolitical agenda on topics that were, in point of fact, profoundly political. A major way in which NICE attempted to resolve this paradox was by placing the onus of securing democracy and development on an imagined local community. It was the community that had a key responsibility for its own well-being, and the problems that hindered its development were, to a great extent, caused by its own misunderstandings. The assumption that the problems with democracy and development could be traced back to the poor themselves called for civic education and capacity building. So he's explored how the sort of human rights discourse promoted by NICE bears within it a kind of contempt for the reality lived by recipients of civic education. This contempt, he says, is informed by human rights activists' belief in universal subjectivity that they alone can redeem. The work that ethnographic witnessing, which is how he positions his work, the work that ethnographic witnessing can do in this circumstance is to bring light to two central issues connected to NICE. First, the state's continuing stranglehold on non-governmental interventions makes it understandable why the managers of NICE consistently train their staff and volunteers to sidestep politics. Through its monopoly on legislation and the means of violence, the state controlled the definition of democracy in Malawi. Second, the evidence presented here demonstrates how the apolitical imperative was sustained by NICE's civic education officers and volunteers. Why would they accept this apolitical disposition when they themselves, as we saw earlier, are frustrated with Malawi's economic and political impasse? Right? The idea being here that in private they voice sharp criticism. So why do they accept this in public? First and foremost, the status distinctions a position at NICE could provide. That's what's so appealing. And so as long as they can gain that status, they will maintain this apolitical disposition. Abstract human rights did not challenge inequalities, but made civic educators the bearer of truth, while it erased from purview specific political and historical conditions. The fact that elites regarded illiterate, rural masses as hardly even their contemporaries did not mean that masses had no informed opinions, as their ambivalent responses to human rights education and their critique of NGOs as greedy elitists shows. So that, again, what Englund is pointing to here is that it's not that the ignorant rural masses, in fact, are uninformed about the challenges that they face in their lives. It's that they're being fed a certain kind of education about human rights that is disconnected from their material and often social realities, and that those who are in a position to do something about human rights and democracy are not listening to what the villagers themselves can demonstrate about the realities of democracy and human rights in Malawi.